good evening, dear friends, and welcome to Watson's Margins. I'm Edward, glad to share another quiet hour of reason with you. Tell me, has your desk grown cluttered today? Papers gathering like small, unspoken stories. Watson believed even the humblest ledger could hold a truth worth pursuing. Do subscribe, so these margins remain open to you. Now, settle in. For as Holmes knew, it is the small, discarded thing that speaks loudest. Find us also on the Watson's Margins Spotify channel, below. Chapter 1. A Visitor Through the Fog. It was, I recall, one of those raw and yellow mornings in November, when London seems to draw a curtain about herself, and the fog presses so thickly against the windows of Baker Street that the gas lamps burn all day like dim, watchful eyes. I had come round to share breakfast with my friend Sherlock Holmes, a habit I had not entirely abandoned even after my marriage, for there remained between us that old companionship which neither time nor domestic happiness could quite dissolve. Holmes was in an indolent mood that morning, reclining in his armchair with his dressing gown drawn about him, curl of blue smoke rising from his pipe toward the ceiling. He had been, as he confessed, somewhat starved of occupation for the better part of a fortnight, and he remarked, with a certain wry humour, that the criminal classes of London appeared to have taken a collective holiday. "You should be grateful for the rest, Holmes," said I, helping myself to another slice of toast. "Rest, Watson, is a virtue only to those whose minds are capable of being idle. Mine, I fear, is not so constituted." He glanced toward the window, where the fog moved like a living thing against the glass. "Though I rather think our period of repose is about to end. Listen, Prue." I heard nothing beyond the muffled clatter of Assam in the street below. But a moment later there came the sound of the bell, followed by an urgent exchange of voices in the hall, and then a hurried tread upon the stair. "A client, and an agitated one," said Holmes, setting down his pipe with evident satisfaction. "Observe the irregularity of his step, Watson, a man pacing while he climbs, uncertain whether to hurry or to compose himself. A professional man, I should think, and one unused to scenes of distress." The door opened. There entered a gentleman of perhaps 50 years, dressed with the sober precision of his calling, though his collar was slightly askew. And his hat, which he carried rather than wore, bore the marks of having been clutched too tightly. His face was pale, and his eyes had the hollow look of a man who had not slept. "Mr. Holmes," said he, in a voice that trembled despite his evident effort at control, "you must forgive this intrusion. I am Percival Trent, solicitor, of Gray's Inn. I come to you upon a matter of the gravest urgency, a matter, I might almost say, of life and death." "Pray be seated, Mr. Trent," said Holmes, with that quiet courtesy which never failed to put even the most distracted client at ease. "Watson, perhaps a glass of brandy? Now, sir, take your time, and tell us from the beginning." Mr. Trent accepted the glass gratefully, and, after a moment's pause to steady himself, began his account. "You will perhaps have read in the papers of the arrest of Sir Julian Markham upon charges of financial fraud connected with the collapse of the Anglo-Colonial Trust." Holmes inclined his head. "I recall the matter. Case built, as I understood it, upon circumstantial accounting irregularities rather than direct evidence." "That is so, and Sir Julian protests his innocence most vigorously. And I, who have known him these 20 years, believe him. That is not the immediate difficulty. Upon his arrest, the magistrate set bail at a sum so enormous, £50,000, that no ordinary surety could be found. It was Mr. Albert Fenwick, a gentleman of considerable fortune and Sir Julian's oldest friend, came forward and pledged the entire sum that Sir Julian might prepare his defence as a free man rather than from a cell. A generous gesture, Holmes observed, and a costly one, should the accused fail to appear. Indeed, Mr. Holmes, and there lies the catastrophe. The hearing at which Sir Julian's case is to be formally reviewed takes place the day after tomorrow. Mr. Fenwick was to appear before the court to confirm the surety in person, as the magistrate had required. But yesterday morning Mr. Fenwick left his house in Bloomsbury, and he has not been seen since. Vanished? I exclaimed. Utterly, Doctor. No word, no message, no trace. His household is in a state of the greatest alarm. And unless he is found or the surety confirmed, by tomorrow evening Sir Julian will be returned at once to custody. And Mr. Fenwick himself, having pledged his fortune, and then disappeared at the critical hour, will be ruined, and worse, suspected of complicity in whatever scheme the prosecution imagines. Holmes had listened to all this, with his eyes half closed, his fingertips pressed together in the attitude I knew so well. A curious problem, said he softly. A man pledges his entire fortune for a friend, and then, on the very eve of redeeming that pledge, disappears as completely as a stone dropped into a pond. Tell me, Mr. Trent, who else stands close to Mr. Fenwick? He has family, I presume. Niece, Miss Clara Fenwick, his only living relative. Who keeps house for him? There is also his secretary, a Mr. Bernard Reeves, who has served him faithfully these many years, and who has been tireless in the search. And of course, Sir Julian's business partner, Mr. Edwin Hargreaves, has been most active in raising the alarm. Inspector Lestrade of Scotland Yard has already begun an investigation, but I confess I have little faith that the official force will move quickly enough to save Sir Julian from disaster. Lestrade is thorough, unimaginative, said Holmes, rising suddenly and crossing to the window, where he stood for a moment gazing out into the grey wall of fog. Watson, I think we must postpone our breakfast. Mr. Trent, if you will give us the address of Mr. Fenwick's house in Bloomsbury, I believe, Doctor, Watson and I might usefully spend the morning there. A man does not vanish without leaving some thread behind him, and it is our business to find it, for the fog of theory obscures it entirely, as this London fog obscures the street. Trent rose with an expression of profound relief. Within the half-hour, Holmes and I were in a cab, rattling through streets that seemed to have lost all their familiar outlines, bound for Bloomsbury, and for a mystery which was to prove, before its end, the strangest and most quietly terrible that I had yet recorded of my friend's career. Chapter 2. The Character of a Missing Man. The house in Bloomsbury stood at the corner of a quiet square, one of those tall, dignified residences whose very brickwork seems to speak of comfortable fortunes accumulated over generations. Even though through the fog I could discern the neat railings, the polished brass of the door furniture, and the drawn blinds of the upper windows, which lent the place an air of mourning before any death had been confirmed. We were admitted by a manservant whose face wore the strained look common to households visited by sudden misfortune, shown into a drawing-room where a young lady rose at once to greet us. She was perhaps 25, dark-haired, and though her composure was evidently maintained with effort, there was a directness in her gaze that I found immediately sympathetic. "Mr. Holmes," said she, "Mr. Trent sent word that you might come. I am Clara Fenwick. I cannot tell you how grateful I am, though I confess I scarcely know what help anyone can offer, when my uncle has simply ceased to exist, as it were, between 1 hour and the next. Let us hope, Miss Fenwick, that the matter is rather more substantial than that," said Holmes. Gentleness I had often observed in him when dealing with those in genuine distress. However brusque he might be with fools or knaves. I wonder whether we might see your uncle's study, and perhaps speak with the household staff who saw him last. She led us upstairs to a handsome room lined with shelves of ledgers and bound papers, the very picture of methodical industry. A heavy desk of dark mahogany stood before the window, its surface bare save for an inkstand, a blotter, and a small brass clock that ticked with maddening evenness into the silence. My uncle was a man of the most exact habits, Miss Fenwick explained. Holmes moved slowly about the room, his eyes travelling over every surface with that air of detached curiosity which I had learned concealed the most intense concentration. He rose at 7, breakfasted at past, and was at this desk by 9 without fail, summer or winter, for as long as I have lived with him. The servants could set their watches by him. A creature of routine, then, said Holmes. And such men, Miss Fenwick, do not vanish lightly, for the very fabric of their lives resists disorder. When did you first notice anything amiss in his manner? She considered. Perhaps 3 weeks ago. He became watchful, I might say. He took to checking the locks upon the doors and windows himself each night, though that had always been Hodges's task. She indicated the manservant, stood near the door, and one evening I came upon him burning papers in this very grate. A great quantity of them. It was not cold enough to warrant a fire. Did he offer any explanation? No, that satisfied me, he said. Only that an old man's papers accumulate like dust, and that it did him good to clear them away. She hesitated. But it was not like him, Mr. Holmes. He kept everything. He once told me that a man's correspondence was the only honest record of his life. Holmes's eyes had sharpened at this, though his voice remained mild. And on the morning of his disappearance, what occurred? It was at this point that a second figure entered the room, spare, grey-eyed man of perhaps 45, dressed with the neat sobriety of a confidential clerk. He introduced himself as Bernard Reeves, Mr. Fenwick's secretary, and I confess that my first impression of him was wholly favourable. He spoke with evident concern. His manner was helpful in the extreme, and he seemed eager to place every fact before us without reserve. I had the misfortune to be the last of the household to speak with him, Mr. Holmes, said Reeves. A letter arrived by hand shortly after 9, while he was at this desk. He read it, and I observed that his colour changed, though he said nothing of its contents to me. He asked for his hat and coat, told me he had an appointment that could not wait, and left the house within 10 minutes. He took nothing with him. No bag, no papers, not even his pocketbook, which he left in this very drawer. Reeves drew open a drawer of the desk to demonstrate, revealing a worn leather pocketbook lying within. You have no notion who sent the letter? None, sir. It was delivered by a street boy, of the kind one might hire for a few pence, and the envelope itself was not preserved. Mr. Fenwick cast it into the fire after reading it. Indeed? Holmes's tone was carefully indifferent, though I, who knew him, marked the sudden stillness that came over him. And yet I observe the grate has been swept since. The maids attend to it each morning, sir, as a matter of course. Naturally. Holmes turned away and crossed to the window, where he stood looking down into the square below, his hands clasped behind his back. Tell me, Mr. Reeves, has Mr. Fenwick spoken to you of any anxiety connected with Sir Julian's case? Threats, perhaps, from those who might wish to see the prosecution succeed. He has, Mr. Holmes, though only in the vaguest terms. He told me a fortnight ago that there were those who would stop at nothing to see Sir Julian convicted. and that I should be careful of strangers about the house. I confess, I thought it an old man's fancy at the time. I think differently now. Holmes nodded slowly, and for some minutes thereafter he occupied himself in a manner that I knew well must have appeared eccentric enough to our hosts, passing his hand lightly along the edge of the desk, examining the surface of the blotter against the light from the window, and even kneeling for a moment to study the carpet beneath the chair. He asked Miss Fenwick a number of questions concerning her uncle's correspondence, to whom he wrote most frequently, whether he kept copies of his letters, and whether any post had arrived for him since his disappearance. To my eye, puest, these inquiries seemed almost wilfully removed from the central question of where the man might now be found, said as much. When at length we took our leave and stood once more in the square, the fog pressing close about us. You seem more interested in Mr. Fenwick's letters, Holmes, than in Mr. Fenwick himself. A man's letters, Watson, very often more honest about him than his own conduct, said Holmes, drawing his collar up against the damp. Noted 3 things in that room which I commend to your attention. The desk, though scrupulously clean, bears the marks of recent and rather heavier use than its owner's tidy habits would suggest. The grate, though swept, retains a faint residue inconsistent with the burning of mere personal correspondence, and our Mr. Reeves, for all his evident candour, knows a very great deal more about Mr. Fenwick's private affairs than any secretary, however trusted. Has any natural right to know. You suspect him? I suspect nothing yet, Watson. I merely observe. But observation, sustained long enough, curious habit of becoming suspicion, and suspicion longer still, of becoming certainty. Come, Charing Cross Station awaits us. I am told a cabman there may have carried our vanishing gentleman upon the last stage of his visible existence. Chapter 3. The Vanishing, Charing Cross Station, even on an ordinary day, presents a scene of considerable confusion to the casual observer. A great vaulted hall, echoing with cries of porters, the hiss of escaping steam, and the perpetual shuffling tread of travellers bound upon 1,000 different errands. Upon that particular afternoon, with the fog drifting in thick coils beneath the iron girders, and turning the gas lamps to smudges of dull orange, the effect was one of positive chaos. And I wondered how Holmes proposed to extract any single thread of fact from such a tangle. Extract it he did, and with a method that I had seen so often before, yet never ceased to admire. "The cabman first, I think," said he. We made our way through the crowd. Trent's clerk was good enough to discover that the man's name is Tupin, and that he frequents the rank upon the Strand side of the station of an afternoon. We found Tupin without great difficulty, a heavy, red-faced fellow, with the weathered look of one who had spent 30 years upon a box in all weathers. He remembered the fare well enough, for, as he told us, gentlemen who paid without quibbling over the distance were not so common as to be easily forgotten. A tall gentleman, sir, grey-whiskered, very upright in his bearing, got in at the corner of the square, just where you'd expect. Round about 9:30, asked to be set down at Charing Cross, Euston's, main entrance, and gave me a shilling over the fare, without so much as a word of complaint. Did he carry anything? A bag, a case? Nothing of the sort, sir. I noticed it particular, because gentleman going on a journey generally has something, even if it's no more than a small case for the night. This one had nothing but a newspaper folded under his arm, and his umbrella, though it wasn't raining. His manner. Was he agitated? Hurried? Tupin scratched his head. Not hurried, sir. Not what I'd call hurried. But there was something, I don't rightly know how to put it. He looked out of the window the whole way, as though he was watching for something, or someone. And once, just as we came round by the church, he gave a kind of start and looked back over his shoulder. But there weren't nothing behind us but the ordinary traffic, far as I could see. Thanked the man. A coin with a coin brought a broad smile to his face, and we passed on into the station itself. Holmes spent the better part of an hour in a manner that would have appeared, to any uninstructed observer, very like aimless wandering. He spoke. Clerks at every window, with two of the porters stationed near the main entrance, and with an elderly woman who kept a small stall of newspapers and sweets just within the doors. The sum of these inquiries, when at last we withdrew to a quiet corner of the refreshment room, proved curious indeed. No ticket was sold to any gentleman answering Mr. Fenwick's description that morning, said Holmes, counting the points upon his fingers in the manner I knew so well. I have shown his photograph. Miss Fenwick was good enough to provide one to every clerk on duty, and not one recalls him. Several recall the morning generally as a quiet one, with few enough passengers to make a distinguished gentleman memorable had he passed before them. Perhaps he purchased no ticket because he did not intend to travel, I suggested. Perhaps he came here only to meet someone. That is precisely the conclusion to which the absence of a ticket points, Watson, and I am glad you have arrived at it without my assistance. There is more. None of the porters recall carrying luggage for any such gentleman, which is, in itself, unremarkable, since Dupin tells us he carried none. But the newspaper woman, who has a memory for faces that would do credit to a detective, recalls a gentleman of Mr. Fenwick's description standing for some minutes near the bookstall, glancing repeatedly toward the entrance, as though awaiting an arrival rather than preparing for a departure of his own. Then he came here to meet someone, said I. That person either did not come, or came and led him away again. On foot, perhaps, or by another cab. That is one possibility, Holmes agreed. Something in his tone suggested he held it loosely. And yet, I confess, my attention has been drawn elsewhere, to a small matter which trod, with his customary thoroughness, regarding the obvious and his customary blindness, regarding the subtle, has entirely overlooked. He drew from his pocket an envelope, somewhat crumpled, which I had not seen him acquire, and laid it upon the table between us. Where in the world did you get that, Holmes? From the waste-basket in Mr. Fenwick's study, while our friend Reeves was occupied in answering Miss Fenwick's questions in the hall. A small theft, Watson, one I think pardonable in the circumstances. Examine it, if you please, and tell me what you observe. I turned the envelope over in my hands. It was addressed in a clerkly hand to Mr. Fenwick at his Bloomsbury residence, though the contents, whatever letter it had once held, were absent. The flap had been opened, as one would expect. But, as I looked closer, I noticed something odd about the seal itself, a small irregularity in the wax that I could not at first account for. The wax appears disturbed somehow, I ventured, though it had been melted and pressed down twice. Excellent, Watson. That is precisely it. This envelope has been opened and resealed and opened again. The first sealing wax is of a slightly different shade. Observe, here, where the edge shows through, from the second, which has been applied rather hastily over the first, presumably to disguise the fact that the letter had been tampered with before ever it reached Mr. Fenwick's hands. Then someone intercepted his correspondence, someone with access to it before delivery. or after delivery and before disposal, which amounts to very nearly the same thing, and narrows our field of suspects considerably. Holmes returned the envelope to his pocket with the air of a man who had acquired a small but valuable piece in a larger game. Reeves told us that Mr. Fenwick burned the letter that summoned him from the house. And yet here is an envelope recovered from that same waste basket, which was never burned at all, only resealed, and discarded as though it were of no consequence. You think Reeves lied to us? I think, Watson, that Reeves told us a story which was very nearly true, and which is for that reason all the more dangerous. The most effective falsehoods are those built upon a foundation of fact. Come. The fog thickens, and Lestrade, I am told, has news of his own this evening. News which I suspect will please everyone concerned save myself, and which will, unless I am very much mistaken, lead this investigation as far from the truth as it is possible to travel. Chapter 4. The Wrong Man. We found Lestrade awaiting us at Baker Street that evening, seated before our fire with the particular satisfactions of a man who believes himself to have settled a difficult matter, and who is eager for an audience before whom to display the fact. He rose as we entered, rubbing his hands together, paused, and I observed that he had brought with him a thin sheaf of papers, which he held as though they constituted, in themselves, complete and final argument. "Mr. Holmes," said he, "I think we may consider this case very nearly closed. I have come straight from the yard, and I felt you would wish to hear the news at once, though I dare say you will tell me you suspected it from the first." "I make no such claim, Lestrade, until I have heard what it is I am to suspect," said Holmes, settling into his chair, and regarding the inspector with that air of polite tension which I had learned could mean a great many things. "Pray, sit down, and tell us your news." "It concerns a man named Nathan Crowley," said Lestrade, consulting his papers, though I suspected he had no real need of them. "A clerk, formerly in the employ of Sir Julian Markham's firm, dismissed some 18 months ago under circumstances that left him with a considerable grievance. He has been heard, on more than one occasion, to express the most violent sentiments against Sir Julian, wishing him ruin, imprisonment, and worse. A disgruntled former employee. Such men are common enough, Lestrade, and their grievances rarely extend to elaborate schemes of abduction. "Ah, but hear me out, Mr. Holmes. 2 witnesses, respectable people, a greengrocer and his wife, place Crowley in the immediate vicinity of Mr. Fenwick's house on the evening before the disappearance. And more than that, we have a 3rd witness, Porter, at a public house not far from Bloomsbury, who overheard a heated quarrel between 2 men on that same evening, one of whom he is now prepared to swear was Mr. Fenwick himself, and the other answering closely to Crowley's description." "Indeed," said Holmes, and though his tone remained even, I caught the faint narrowing of his eyes, that told me his interest, far from being satisfied, had merely changed its direction. "And what does Crowley himself say to all this?" Lestrade's expression became, if possible, even more triumphant. "That is the best of it, Mr. Holmes. Crowley has vanished as well, left his lodgings yesterday morning, paid what he owed, and has not been seen since. My men are watching the ports already. The case, I think, explains itself. Crowley discovered that Fenwick stood as surety for the very man he hated, saw in it an opportunity to strike at Sir Julian through his oldest friend, lured Fenwick away on some pretext, and has either done away with him or is holding him somewhere until the hearing has passed, and the bail is forfeit. I confess that hearing the matter laid out in this fashion I found it difficult to resist its logic. Pieces fitted together with a neatness that seemed almost to demand acceptance. The grievance, the proximity, the quarrel, the simultaneous disappearance. Even the fog outside our windows seemed, for a moment, to lift a little, though the world itself approved of so tidy a solution. "It is a most coherent theory, Lestrade," said Holmes slowly, "and I confess I can find no flaw in its construction. And yet," he paused, and reached for the appointment ledger which Miss Fenwick had permitted him, with some reluctance, bring away from the Bloomsbury house. "There is one small matter which troubles me, and which I should be glad of your opinion upon, Lestrade, since you have not yet seen it." He opened the ledger upon the table between us, turning the pages with that unhurried care he gave to all such examinations, until he came to an entry some 3 weeks past. An appointment, recorded in Fenwick's own neat hand, with the initials N.C., against a date and hour in the late afternoon. "You will observe," said Holmes, "that Mr. Fenwick recorded an appointment with someone bearing the initials N.C., which might very well stand for Nathan Crowley, some 3 weeks before his disappearance. Does this not strike you as significant, Lestrade? It would suggest that Fenwick and Crowley were not strangers brought together by chance, but had some prior dealing. Perhaps even that Fenwick himself sought Crowley out, for reasons we do not yet understand." Lestrade examined the entry with evident interest. "It strengthens my case rather than weakens it, Mr. Holmes. Perhaps Crowley approached Fenwick weeks ago, sounding him out, gaining his confidence, the better to lure him away when the moment came." "Perhaps," said Holmes. "Perhaps not. Perhaps not." He closed the ledger, but I observed that as he did so, his fingers lingered for a moment upon the edge of the page, and that his eyes had taken on that peculiarly distant quality which I had come to associate with the working of his mind upon some problem not yet ready to be spoken aloud. When Lestrade had taken his leave, in excellent spirits, and with many expressions of confidence that the matter would be resolved within a day or two, at most, Holmes sat for a long while in silence, pipe unlit, his gaze fixed upon the fire. "You are not satisfied, Holmes," said I at length. "And yet I confess the case against Crowley seems strong enough. Motive?"
The quarrel, his flight.
"It is too strong, Watson. It is precisely what troubles me." He rose and crossed to the window, drawing aside the curtain to look out into the fog-bound street. "Consider the entry in that ledger. I examined it most carefully this afternoon, while Lestrade was occupied with his theories, and I found something which I did not mention to him, for I am not yet certain what it signifies, and I have no wish to send our friend chasing yet another hare before I am sure of the scent myself." "What did you find?" "The entry recording the appointment with N.C. is written in ink very slightly different in colour from the entries immediately before and after it, difference so slight that no one would remark it who was not looking for such things, and which no expert, I think, could swear to under oath. The hand, though it imitates Fenwick's own with considerable skill, lacks a certain looseness, shall we say, in the formation of the letter F, appears in his genuine entries with an idiosyncratic flourish that the forger, if forger there be, has not quite managed to reproduce." I stared at him. "You believe the entry was inserted afterward? Forged?" "I believe, Watson, that someone wished very much for the police to discover precisely the connection which Lestrade has just laid before us, with such satisfaction. I believe that someone foresaw the direction in which suspicion would naturally turn. Once Crowley's grievance against Sir Julian became known, took pains to ensure that the ledger would confirm what the witnesses would later be brought to testify. But who could have access to that ledger to make such an alteration? Holmes turned from the window, and in the dim light his face wore an expression I had seen before. On the eve of some revelation he was not yet prepared to share, a kind of grave, almost reluctant certainty. That, my dear Watson, is a question with a very small number of possible answers. And I think, before this affair is concluded, we shall find that the smallness of that number is the key to the whole matter. But I will say no more tonight. Tomorrow, I think, we must return to Bloomsbury and look once more at the desk for what is missing. Chapter 5. Silent Reconstructions. I had expected, when Holmes spoke of returning to Bloomsbury, that we should once again present ourselves at the front door of the Fenwick house and resume our questioning of its occupants. I was therefore somewhat surprised, upon waking the following morning, to find a note propped against the coffee pot, written in Holmes's swift, angular hand, informing me that he had gone out upon business of his own, and that I was not to expect him before evening. It was, I confess, one of those days which try a chronicler's patience sorely, for there is little so tantalizing as the knowledge that great matters are proceeding while one is left to one's own devices with nothing but conjecture for company. I occupied myself as best I could with my correspondence, and with the morning papers, which continued to speculate, in ever more lurid terms, upon the fate of the missing financier, though I noted with some relief that no mention had yet been made of Crowley, and concluded that Lestrade, for once, had kept his own counsel a little longer than was his habit. It was past 7 that evening when Holmes returned, weary, but with that particular brightness about the eyes which I had learned to recognise as the surest sign that his day had not been wasted. Flung himself into his chair, accepted the plate of cold supper which Mrs. Hudson had thoughtfully kept warm for him, for some minutes ate in silence, while I forced myself to wait, knowing from long experience that he would tell his tale in his own time and not before. "I have spent the day, Watson," said he, at length, "in the company of clerks, bankers, messengers, one extremely voluble housemaid, and I have, I think, succeeded in reconstructing a tolerably complete picture of Mr. Fenwick's last week of liberty." "And what does that picture show?" "A pattern, Watson, and patterns, in my experience, very much more eloquent than isolated facts, however striking. Let me give it to you as I have assembled it." He drew from his pocket a small notebook filled with his own cramped notation, and consulted it as he spoke. On the Monday Mr. Fenwick met privately with his niece, Miss Clara, in this very study, for upwards of an hour after the rest of the household had retired. The housemaid, who was sent to bed late and happened to pass the door, heard voices raised, not in anger. She was careful to say, in what she described as a serious sort of talking, the kind one hears at a sick-bed or a death-bed. On the Tuesday, he continued, he met, in the late afternoon, with Mr. Edwin Hargreaves, Sir Julian's business partner, at Hargreaves's own offices in the city. I obtained this from a junior clerk, who remembered the visit because Mr. Fenwick arrived without an appointment, and was kept waiting some 20 minutes, which he bore. The clerk said, remarkable patience for a man of his standing. And on the Wednesday? On the Wednesday evening he met with Reeves, though not this time in the study, but in a small private room at his bank, where Reeves had been sent that afternoon upon some pretext of business. Bank clerk, who admitted them, recalls that Mr. Fenwick asked, quite particularly, that they should not be disturbed, that the meeting lasted nearly 2 hours. I confess I found this catalogue of secret meetings, laid out so plainly, more disquieting than any single dramatic discovery could have been. 3 separate, private conferences, Holmes with the 3 people closest to him, and all within the space of a few days, immediately before his disappearance. Just so. And there is more. I called also upon Mr. Fenwick's bankers, and there, after a certain amount of persuasion, for bankers, Watson, are creatures of great discretion, rightly so, I learned that Mr. Fenwick had, some 10 days ago, executed a new will, superseding one of many years' standing, and had lodged it with his solicitors, under instructions that it was not to be opened save in the event of his death, not even then without certain formalities which the manager declined to specify further. A new will. Then he anticipated, what, Holmes? His own death. He anticipated something, Watson, of that there can be no doubt. A man does not alter the disposition of his entire fortune in secret within a fortnight of vanishing, unless he believes some great change in his circumstances to be imminent. The question is what change he anticipated, and whether he believed it would come from without, or— Holmes paused, chewed, and I saw him choose his next word with unusual care. Or from within his own household. You mean to say he feared one of these 3 people, his niece, his partner's associate, his secretary. I mean to say that he met, in secret, with each of them in turn, and that shortly afterward he altered his will, became watchful of locks, and burned papers which he had kept, by his own account, for the whole of his life. These are not the actions of a man troubled by abstract anxieties, Watson. They are the actions of a man narrowing a circle, testing, perhaps, the loyalty of those nearest to him, and discovering something in the process which alarmed him a very great deal. I sat for a time turning this over in my mind. But surely, Holmes, if he suspected one of these 3 of some treachery, the most natural course would have been to confide in someone outside that circle. In Mr. Trent, his solicitor, or in the police. You would think so, Watson, and that is precisely what gives me the most uneasiness of all. He did not go to Trent. He did not go to the police. Whatever he discovered, he chose to address it himself, quietly, poured within his own household. Which suggests either that he did not yet possess proof sufficient to act upon openly, that the matter touched someone he could not bear to expose without absolute certainty. Holmes set down his notebook and looked into the fire. For a long moment neither of us spoke. There is one further thing, Watson, which I have saved until last, because I confess I do not yet know what to make of it. What is that? In the course of my inquiries at the bank, I learned that Mr. Reeves, our calm, helpful, and endlessly forthcoming Mr. Reeves, has, for upwards of 15 years, possessed full power of attorney over a considerable portion of Mr. Fenwick's investments. A power renewed annually, and renewed, as it happens, only 6 weeks ago, with Mr. Fenwick's own signature fresh upon the document. A secretary, Watson, with such authority, occupies a position of trust very nearly equal to that of a partner, and a man does not grant such trust, year after year, to one he does not believe entirely faithful. Then Reeves's loyalty was, until recently, beyond question. So it would appear, and yet, within 6 weeks of renewing that trust, Fenwick was burning papers, altering his will, and meeting his secretary in the strictest privacy at the bank itself. A meeting, Watson, which lasted 2 hours, and of which not one word has reached us, save that it occurred. Holmes rose, knocking out his pipe against the grate, and there was, in the set of his shoulders, something I had rarely seen in him, a kind of reluctance, though the shape of the truth were already forming in his mind, and he found little pleasure in its outline. I think, Watson, that tomorrow we must look into Mr. Fenwick's past. for I have a growing suspicion that whatever was discussed in that room at the bank concerned not the future, but something long buried which someone believed safely forgotten. Chapter 6. Shadows of Identity. The morning that followed brought no relief from the fog which had now settled over London. For the better part of 3 days, lending even the most familiar streets an air of unreality, as though the city itself had become uncertain of its own boundaries. Holmes breakfasted hurriedly, scarcely speaking, and announced his intention of spending the day among what he called the bones of old failures, by which, he explained, he meant the records of defunct companies and forgotten financial scandals that lie, mouldering and unread, in certain archives known chiefly to lawyers, journalists, and those few private inquiry agents whose work occasionally requires a long memory. Proud. I did not accompany him upon this occasion, having promised to look in upon a patient whose case admitted of no postponement, but I confess that throughout the day my thoughts returned again and again to the strange picture Holmes had drawn the evening before, of a careful, methodical man, suddenly and secretly rearranging the whole structure of his life, as though preparing either to defend himself against some blow, to deliver one. It was nearly 9 in the evening before Holmes returned, and I knew at once the particular quality of his silence as he removed his coat and seated himself by the fire, that he had found something of significance, something which for once gave him no satisfaction in the finding. "You have had a profitable day, I think," said I, "though I fear not an entirely pleasant one. You read me too easily, Watson, or I have grown too transparent in my old age, though I am not yet 40, which scarcely qualifies as old age by any reasonable reckoning." He accepted the glass I poured for him, but did not drink from it at once. "I have spent the day, as I told you, among old records, and I have found, buried among them, a name. Fenwick's? Not quite, or rather yes, but not under that name." He set down his glass and drew from his breast pocket a folded paper, yellowed with age, which he smoothed out upon his knee. 20 years ago, Watson, there existed a financial syndicate, modest enough in its ambitions, but disastrous in its execution, known as the Wessex and Colonial Investment Society. It collapsed, as such ventures so often do, amid recriminations, lawsuits, and a great deal of ruined gentility. Among its directors, one of 3 in fact, together bore the chief responsibility for its failure, was a gentleman named Albert Winstanley. Winstanley, not Fenwick. Not Fenwick, Watson. And yet observe. He passed me the paper, and I saw among a list of names set out in the formal language of some long-forgotten legal proceeding the entry, "Albert J. Winstanley of Leamington, gentlemen." I traced this Winstanley, Watson, through 3 changes of address and as many changes of occupation, across the better part of 20 years. A tedious business, I assure you, involving a great deal of dust and a great many clerks who could not imagine why anyone should care about so old and so unremarkable a failure. Crowd. And at the end of that trail, Watson, I find a gentleman who some 15 years ago took up residence in London under the name by which we know him now. A gentleman who had by then acquired a respectable fortune, through means I have not yet had time to trace, and who has, ever since, conducted himself as a model of probity and discretion. You are telling me that Albert Fenwick and Albert Winstanley are the same man? I am telling you, Watson, that the evidence points very strongly in that direction, though I should wish for more certainty before I stated it as fact. The age corresponds, the Christian name corresponds, and there is, moreover, a curious detail. Among the papers of the failed syndicate, I found a specimen of Winstanley's signature. And though 20 years and a change of name lie between it and the signature in Fenwick's appointment, there is, in the formation of certain letters, the same idiosyncratic flourish upon the letter F, Watson, which I mentioned to you in connection with the forged entry. A similarity I do not think can be entirely accidental. I sat back, turning this extraordinary discovery over in my mind. Then, if this is true, if Fenwick concealed, for 15 years, an entirely different identity, connected with a financial scandal of 20 years' standing, and if someone discovered this secret, then we have, at last, motive for something, Watson, though precisely what, I am not yet prepared to say. Blackmail is the obvious suggestion, and I confess it was my own first thought. A respectable man, his fortune and his standing built upon a name not truly his own, pay a very great deal to ensure that the connection between Albert Fenwick and Albert Winstanley remained buried. He paused, and there was something in his expression that told me the matter was not so simple as I had supposed. And yet, Watson, here is the difficulty. I have also, in the course of today's labours, examined the letters which arrived at Fenwick's office during the past month. Miss Fenwick was good enough to permit this, and Reeves, I observed, made no objection, though he watched the proceeding with rather more attention than I should have expected from a man with nothing to fear from it. And what did the letters contain? That is precisely what is so curious, Watson. 3 letters arrived, at intervals of some days each in the same hand. A hand disguised, I think, though not unskilfully. And not one of them contains a single word that could properly be called a threat. There is no demand for money, no allusion to ruin or exposure, no menace of any kind that a court of law could recognise. Each letter, in substance, asks only for a meeting, a private interview, at a time and place of Mr. Fenwick's own choosing, upon a matter described only as a circumstance from the past which the writer believes Mr. Fenwick would wish to have settled quietly. But that is blackmail in all but name. It is the shadow of blackmail, Watson, without its substance. And shadows, as I have had occasion to remark before, are notoriously difficult to grasp. Blackmailer, who never names his price, never specifies his knowledge, and never threatens exposure, is either remarkably patient, remarkably subtle, or— Holmes paused again, and this time the pause was longer, and when he resumed, his voice had taken on a quality I can only describe as troubled. Or is not a blackmailer at all, but someone using the appearance of blackmail to draw Fenwick into a private meeting, for purposes that have nothing whatever to do with money. Fire crackled in the silence that followed, and I found myself glancing, almost involuntarily, toward the window, where the fog pressed against the glass like some vast, patient presence. "You spoke before you went out this morning, looking into Reeves's position," said I at last. "Have you learned anything more of him?" "I have, Watson, though I had hoped to find less. Reeves, transpires, has been in Fenwick's employ for some 17 years. A period, you will observe, which falls entirely within the time since Winstanley became Fenwick. I have been unable as yet to discover anything of Reeves's history before that date. No references that can be traced. No former employer who can be found. Nothing but the bare fact of his engagement, recorded in Fenwick's own hand 17 years ago this coming spring." Holmes drank off his glass at last and rose to knock out his pipe against the grate. "A secretary who appears from nowhere, Watson, in the same year that a new identity is established, and who has ever since possessed a knowledge of his employer's affairs more intimate than any ordinary servant's duties could account for. I do not say it proves anything, but it is, I think, a coincidence too large to be left unexamined, and tomorrow, I believe, the time has come to examine it. Chapter 7. Perfect Explanation. We had scarcely finished breakfast of the following morning when Lestrade arrived once more at Baker Street, and his manner had passed beyond mere satisfaction into something approaching jubilation. He came in without waiting to be properly announced. His hat still upon his head, stood before the fire rubbing his hands together, with an energy that seemed to me almost indecent at so early an hour. "Mr. Holmes, think we may now consider the matter settled in every particular," said he, before he had so much as taken a seat. "The case against Crowley is complete." "Complete?" Holmes repeated, setting down his coffee cup with great deliberation. "That is a strong word, Lestrade. Pray, sit down and let us hear the whole of it." Lestrade required no second invitation. He drew a chair close to the fire, produced his notebook, and began to set out his case with the air of a man laying a winning hand upon the table. Card by card, pleasure of seeing his opponent's face fall. "In the first place," said he, "we have the witness I mentioned before, the porter at the public house. And I am glad to say that since I last spoke with you, 2 further witnesses have come forward, both of whom confirm that they saw a man answering Crowley's description in the immediate neighbourhood of Mr. Fenwick's house. Not once, but on several occasions during the week preceding the disappearance. One of these witnesses, a respectable tobacconist, calls Crowley asking, quite casually, as though merely making conversation, what hours Mr. Fenwick generally kept, and whether he was a gentleman of regular habits. A natural enough question for anyone with criminal designs upon a man's movements, Holmes observed. Pray continue. In the second place, Mr. Holmes, we have established a clear connection between Crowley and Sir Julian's case, beyond the mere fact of his dismissal. It transpires that Crowley, in his former position, had access to certain of the very accounts now under examination by the prosecution, and that his dismissal followed shortly upon his discovery of irregularities which, had he reported them through proper channels, might have brought the whole fraud to light 18 months earlier than it was, fact discovered. Crowley believes, rightly or wrongly, that Sir Julian had him dismissed precisely to silence him, and that the subsequent prosecution, when it came, was a kind of vindication which Crowley felt should have been his own. A grievance, then, long-standing, and one which touches the very heart of the present case, said Holmes. This is a more substantial matter than I had supposed, and the appointment recorded in Fenwick's ledger. Have you formed any theory as to its meaning in light of this? I have indeed, Mr. Holmes, and I think it the final piece of the puzzle. Consider Crowley, nursing his grievance, learns that Fenwick has pledged his fortune to secure Sir Julian's liberty. What more natural than that Crowley should seek out Fenwick? Perhaps under some pretext of offering information helpful to Sir Julian's defence, better to gain his confidence. And that this meeting, recorded weeks in advance, the first step in a scheme which culminated in Fenwick's disappearance. Crowley learns Fenwick's habits, gains his trust, and then, on the chosen day, lures him away. Perhaps with some message purporting to come from Sir Julian himself, or from his solicitors. And Fenwick, suspecting nothing, walks willingly into whatever trap has been prepared for him. I will confess that, hearing the case laid out in this manner, with each fact dovetailing so neatly into the next, I found myself almost persuaded. The grievance was real. The connection to Sir Julian's case was established. The proximity of Crowley to the house was attested by no fewer than 3 witnesses, appointment in the ledger, which Holmes himself had remarked upon as significant, now appeared to slot into the narrative with an almost satisfying precision. Even the resealed envelope, I thought, might be explained. Perhaps Crowley himself had intercepted the letter that summoned Fenwick from the house, resealing it after reading its contents to ensure his plan went forward as intended. "It is, I must say, a most complete account," said I, glancing toward Holmes. "I confess, Holmes, that I find it difficult to see what remains unexplained." Holmes did not answer me directly. He had risen from his chair during Lestrade's recital, and now stood by the window, his back to us both, looking out into the fog with an attitude of such profound stillness that I wondered whether he had heard my remark at all. "You have done well, Lestrade," he said at last, though there was something in his voice, a kind of careful neutrality, that gave me pause. "Your case is, Watson says, complete. Every fact you have laid before us points in a single direction, and points there with a consistency that I cannot fault. I have indeed only one small observation to offer, so small that I hesitate to mention it, lest it seem mere pedantry." "By all means, Mr. Holmes," said Lestrade, though I detected in his tone the indulgent patience of a man humouring an eccentric colleague. "It concerns the entry in Fenwick's appointment ledger. The entry recording the meeting with N.C., which you take, reasonably enough, to be the first step in Crowley's scheme." Holmes turned from the window and crossed to the side table where the ledger still lay, untouched since the previous evening. "I have examined this entry with some care, Lestrade, and I find that the ink in which it is written differs, very slightly, from the ink used in the entries immediately surrounding it. A difference scarcely perceptible, but present nonetheless. I find also that the hand, while a creditable imitation of Fenwick's own, departs in one small particular, the formation of the letter F, from his customary style, in a manner consistent with forgery." Lestrade's expression underwent a curious transformation, from confidence to puzzlement to a kind of dawning irritation. "For Mr. Holmes suggests that the entry was inserted afterward. By whom? And to what purpose? It can scarcely have been Crowley himself, who has no access to the ledger. That is precisely the difficulty, Lestrade. And it is why I raise the matter now, before your case proceeds further. If the entry is genuine, then your theory holds, and I withdraw my observation entirely. But if it is not genuine, if someone other than Fenwick inserted that entry at some date after it purports to record, then the entire foundation of your case rests not upon evidence of Crowley's guilt, but upon evidence manufactured to suggest it. And manufactured evidence, Lestrade, points not toward the hand that committed the crime, but toward the hand that created the evidence, which may be a very different hand indeed." There was a long silence. I saw Lestrade glance at the ledger, then at Holmes, and I confess that, upon his face, I read the particular discomfort of a man who has built an elegant structure, only to be told that its foundation may be sand. "You have no proof of this, Mr. Holmes," said he, at last, though with rather less conviction than before. "I have no proof that would satisfy a court, Lestrade, not yet. I have only an observation, and a question, which that observation raises, and which I think we cannot honestly set aside merely because it is inconvenient." Holmes closed the ledger gently, and there was, in the gesture, something almost gentle, as though he were closing a door upon a room he did not wish to enter, yet knew he must. "Give me until tomorrow evening, Lestrade. If I am wrong, your case against Crowley remains exactly as strong as it was an hour ago." and you have lost nothing but a single day. But if I am right, then I think we shall find that the truth of this matter lies very much closer to Mr. Fenwick's own hearth than any of us has yet been willing to suppose. Chapter 8, The Detail No One Saw. Lestrade departed in a mood considerably subdued from that in which he had arrived. And for the remainder of that day Holmes was, by his own admission, thinking, a process which, in his case, involved long periods of silence, punctuated by short, restless excursions about the room, and which I had long since learned not to interrupt. He spoke scarcely a dozen words to me before evening. Those few were of no consequence whatever. Remarks upon the weather, an inquiry as to whether I had any tobacco to spare, and a single observation, delivered apropos of nothing. That the human mind possesses a regrettable tendency to mistake the dramatic for the true. It was not until after dark, the fog, if anything, thicker than ever, so that the lamps along Baker Street showed us no more than faint smudges of light, that Holmes rose abruptly from his chair and announced that we were to return once more to Bloomsbury. At this hour, Holmes, the household will be retiring. That, Watson, is precisely why I wish to go now. There is a particular quality to a room at night, when its ordinary occupants have withdrawn from it, which daylight and bustle conspire to disguise. I wish to see Mr. Fenwick's study as it is, rather than as it has been arranged for our benefit. We made our way through the fog-bound streets in near silence, and upon our arrival, Miss Fenwick, though clearly surprised by the lateness of the hour, admitted herself, the servants having for the most part retired. Holmes asked, with great courtesy, that we might be permitted to sit for a while in the study, undisturbed, and that no one need trouble themselves upon our account. You wish to be alone, Mr. Holmes? I wish, Miss Fenwick, to be alone with the room, which is not quite the same thing, though I shall be glad of Dr. Watson's company, since two pairs of eyes, even when one of them sees a good deal less than the other, are generally better than one. She withdrew, with a last anxious glance about the study, and Holmes, once the door had closed behind her, did not at once begin his examination, but instead seated himself in Fenwick's own chair behind the great mahogany desk, and sat motionless for some minutes, simply looking about the room, at the shelves, the window, the grate, the door, as though seeing it for the first time. "Tell me, Watson," said he at length, "what would you say is the most striking feature of this room?" I looked about me, somewhat at a loss. Its order, I suppose. Everything in its place. The ledgers ranged by date, the papers squared upon the desk. Even the inkstand set precisely parallel to the blotter. So, a man's habits, Watson, are written in the arrangement of his possessions as plainly as in any diary. And Fenwick's habits, by every account we have received, were those of the most rigid precision. Now, he rose and crossed to the shelves which lined one wall, running his finger lightly along the spines of the bound ledgers ranged there, each labelled with a year in neat lettering. Observe these volumes, 20 years of them, Watson, each in its place, each undisturbed, save. His finger paused, and I saw him frown slightly. Save for a gap, here, between the volume for 2 years past, and that for the present year. A gap, just wide enough, I think, for a single volume of similar size. Missing ledger. A missing box, Watson, rather than a ledger. For observe the dust upon the shelf itself, here in the gap, compared with the shelf on either side. The dust elsewhere has lain undisturbed for some weeks at least, forming an even film. But here, within the gap, the wood is comparatively clean. Clean, that is, save for a faint rectangular outline somewhat larger than any single ledger, which suggests that something of considerable size stood here until quite recently and was removed. I bent to examine the shelf myself, and saw, indeed, a pale rectangle upon the dark wood, sharp-edged, as though something had stood there for a very long time, and had only lately been taken away. A document box, you said before. A document box, Watson, of the kind in which a careful man might keep papers of particular importance, separate from his ordinary correspondence and accounts. And its absence, taken together with the burning of papers which Miss Fenwick described to us, suggests that whatever Fenwick had gathered, whatever evidence or record, proof of something he had discovered, has been removed from this house entirely, either by Fenwick himself or by someone else. He turned next to the desk, and here his examination became, if anything, even more minute. He drew open each drawer in turn, examining not merely their contents, but the runners upon which they slid, and the underside of the desk itself, which he inspected at by the light of a candle, lying upon the floor, to do so in a manner that would have appeared, to any observer ignorant of his methods, very much like the behaviour of a madman. And here, Watson, is our second curiosity. He rose, brushing the dust from his sleeve, and held out to me, upon his open palm, a small quantity of grey ash, found this lodged in the angle between the drawer and its runner, fallen there, I should think, from a cigar held carelessly, while its smoker leaned across the desk to reach something upon the far side. Smell it, if you will. I did so, detected a faint, sweetish odour, quite distinct from the heavier tobacco I associated with Holmes's own pipe. A Trichinopoly cigar, unless I am much mistaken, said Holmes, and a particular brand of it, at that, for there are perhaps a dozen varieties commonly sold in London. This is among the more expensive. Now, Watson, I asked Miss Fenwick this very afternoon, while you were occupied with your patient, what tobacco her uncle favoured, and she informed me, without hesitation, that he smoked nothing but a mild Virginia mixture, in a pipe, and that he had, in fact, a positive dislike of cigars, the smell of which he found oppressive. Then this ash belongs to a visitor, Watson, who sat, or stood, close enough to this desk to lean across it, smoking a cigar of a kind its owner disliked, and careless enough, confident enough, to let the ash fall where it would. A small thing, you will say, and so it is. But small things, Watson, accumulate, and it is by their accumulation, rather than by any single dramatic discovery, that the truth is generally arrived at. He stood for a long while. After this, the ash still resting upon his palm, looking down at the desk with an expression I had rarely seen upon his face. Not the bright, eager look of the chase, but something graver, more reluctant, as of a man who sees at last the shape of a conclusion he has been labouring, almost against his own will, to avoid. "Holmes," said I, "you have found something more than ash and dust here tonight. I can see it in your face. I have found, Watson, a single entry in this ledger." He drew it toward him, and opened it to the page he had examined before, page bearing the forged appointment with NCC, which I had previously studied for what it contained. Tonight, sitting in this chair, in this light, I studied it instead, for what it did not contain. And I find, Watson, that the ink of this single entry, held to the candle at the correct angle, shows a faint sheen which the surrounding entries do not show. The sheen of ink that has not yet fully penetrated the fibre of the paper, as ink does over weeks and months. This entry, Watson, was not written 3 weeks ago, purports to have been. It was written within the last few days. Perhaps even within the last few hours before Lestrade's witnesses came forward to swear to a meeting that I am now all but certain never took place at all. Then someone forged this entry recently, after the disappearance, to direct suspicion toward Crowley. Someone, Watson, who had access to this ledger, to this desk, to this room, at any hour of the day or night. Someone whose presence here would excite no remark, however late, however private the circumstances. Someone, moreover, who smokes Trichinopoly cigars, and who has, I think, grown a little too confident in the completeness of his own arrangements. Holmes closed the ledger softly and looked up at me across the candle's small, steady flame. I think, Watson, we have troubled this household enough for one night, but tomorrow, believe, we shall have need of Lestrade once more, and of every fact we have gathered, set out in its proper order, before an audience that includes every person who has had a hand, knowingly or otherwise, in this affair. Holmes explains. Following evening, our sitting room at Baker Street presented an appearance it had not worn in some time. That of a small theatre, arranged for a performance, whose nature only one of those present could have predicted. Holmes had asked Mrs. Hudson to set out additional chairs, and by 7 o'clock these were occupied by Mr. Trent, pale and anxious as ever, by Miss Clara Fenwick, who sat very upright, her hands folded tightly in her lap, by Mr. Edwin Hargreaves, a stout, florid gentleman whom I had not previously met, and who bore the harried look of a man whose own affairs hung upon the outcome of the evening, and by Mr. Bernard Reeves, who had arrived last of all, and who took his seat with the same calm, attentive courtesy he had shown throughout our acquaintance. Lestrade stood near the door, his arms folded, wearing the expression of a man who has agreed to a course of action against his better judgment, and who reserves the right to say so afterward. Holmes himself remained standing by the fireplace, and when all was settled he began to speak, not abruptly, as I had half expected, but with a slow, almost gentle deliberation, as though he were leading us, step by step, along a path whose end he alone could see. Because I believe I can now give an account of what became of Mr. Albert Fenwick, an account which, I fear, will bring little comfort to anyone in this room, but which I believe to be the truth, which I think you would all, in the end, prefer to hear than to remain forever in doubt. A silence followed, broken only by the small sounds of the fire. "Let me begin," Holmes continued, "not with Mr. Fenwick's disappearance, but with Mr. Fenwick himself. For I believe that the key to this whole affair lies not in the events of a single morning, but in the history of a single man, a history which he had for 15 years kept entirely to himself." He then related, in substance, what he had discovered among the old records of the failed Wessex and Colonial Investment Society. The existence, 20 years before, a director named Albert Winstanley, and the strong probability, which he now stated with rather more confidence than he had shown to me, that Winstanley and Fenwick were one and the same man who had, upon coming to London some 15 years ago, quietly assumed a new name and built, upon the wreckage of an old failure, a new and entirely respectable fortune. I watched the faces of our small audience as Holmes spoke. Miss Fenwick's expression was one of pure astonishment. Hargreaves frowned, as though struggling to fit this revelation into some scheme of his own. Trent merely looked bewildered. But Reeves sat very still, his hands resting lightly upon his knees, his face composed into an expression of polite, attentive interest. And it was this very stillness, I think, which first told me that Holmes's words had found their mark. This in itself, Holmes continued, would be no more than an old man's secret, buried and harmless, were it not for what followed. Some weeks ago, Mr. Fenwick began to receive letters which made no threat, demanded no payment, but which asked, with great delicacy, for a private interview concerning a circumstance from the past. Mr. Fenwick, I believe, understood at once what circumstance was meant, and he did something which I confess puzzled me for some time. He did not flee, he did not pay, he did not consult his solicitor. Instead, he began, quietly and methodically, to gather evidence. "Evidence of what, Mr. Holmes?" asked Trent. "That, Mr. Trent, is the second thread of this affair, and one which, until 2 days ago, I had supposed entirely separate from the first. You will recall that Sir Julian Markham stands accused of fraud connected with the affairs of the Anglo-Colonial Trust. Fraud which the prosecution attributes to irregularities in certain accounts under his control. I believe, gentlemen, that Mr. Fenwick, in the course of reviewing those very accounts, for he had, as Sir Julian's oldest friend, been given access to them in order to assess the prospects of the defence, discovered that the irregularities did not originate with Sir Julian at all. "Then who?" began Hargreaves, but Holmes raised a hand. "They originated, gentlemen, with the one person who had, for upwards of 15 years, possessed both the access and the authority to manipulate Mr. Fenwick's own investments. Investments which, I have since learned, were intertwined with those of the Anglo-Colonial Trust, to a degree of which Sir Julian himself was wholly unaware. They originated, in short, Mr. Fenwick's own secretary." Every eye in the room turned toward Reeves, who had not moved, but whose face, I now observed, taken on a curious pallor. "This is a very serious accusation, Mr. Holmes," said he, and his voice, though steady, had lost something of its former warmth. "I trust you do not make it lightly. I make it, Mr. Reeves, upon the following grounds, and I shall be glad if you will correct me where I am in error." Holmes's tone remained perfectly courteous. There was, beneath it, a quality of relentlessness that I had heard before, and which I knew preceded only one outcome. Some years ago, I cannot yet say precisely when, though I believe further inquiry would establish it, you began to conceal certain losses sustained through investments made on Mr. Fenwick's behalf, by means of falsified accounts. For a long while, this concealment succeeded, for Mr. Fenwick trusted you absolutely, and had no occasion to examine your work closely. But the entanglement of these accounts with those of the Anglo-Colonial Trust meant that when the Trust's affairs came under the scrutiny of the prosecution in connection with Sir Julian's case, the irregularities you had so long concealed stood in some danger of being discovered, not as evidence against Sir Julian, but as evidence of an entirely different fraud committed by an entirely different hand. "And Fenwick discovered this," said Trent slowly, "while reviewing the accounts to help his friend." "He did, Mr. Trent, and being the careful man he was, he said nothing to anyone, but began quietly to assemble the proof, gathering documents into a box which he kept upon the shelf of his study, and at the same time taking certain precautions of his own. He altered, he grew watchful of locks. He met in turn with his niece, with Mr. Hargreaves, and finally with Mr. Reeves himself, at the bank in private for a meeting that lasted 2 hours, and of which we have no record save its occurrence." "What passed at that meeting, Mr. Holmes?" said Reeves quietly, "if you are so well informed of everything else." "I believe, Mr. Reeves, that Mr. Fenwick confronted you with what he had discovered. Perhaps not yet certain of the full extent of it, but certain enough to demand an explanation, and perhaps to give you an opportunity to make what restitution you could, quietly. Before the matter became public through Sir Julian's trial, I believe you asked for time, and that Mr. Fenwick, out of 15 years' trust, and perhaps out of some lingering fellow feeling for a man who, like himself, had once stood upon the edge of ruin, granted it. And then the word came from Miss Fenwick, in a voice scarcely above a whisper. And then Miss Fenwick, on the morning of the appointed hearing, the very day on which the accounts must be produced, and the irregularities, sooner or later, discovered. Mr. Reeves came to this house, not as a clerk attending upon his master's business, but as a man whose entire future, built upon 15 years of careful concealment, stood upon the point of collapse. I believe a letter was contrived. A letter purporting to come from some person connected with the case, summoning Mr. Fenwick to a meeting, though the truth is simpler and very much closer to home. I believe no such meeting ever took place. I believe Mr. Fenwick never left this house alive. Chapter 10, The Final Reflection. For a long moment after Holmes had spoken those final words, no one in the room moved or spoke. The fire settled with a small crash of falling coal, and somewhere below, in the street, I heard the muffled bell of a passing hansom. Sounds which seemed, in that silence, to belong to some other and more ordinary world than the one which had suddenly opened before us. It was Reeves, who broke the silence at last, and when he spoke, the change in him was extraordinary. The calm, helpful, faintly deferential manner, which he had maintained throughout our acquaintance, fell away from him like a discarded garment, and what remained was a man grey with exhaustion, who seemed in that moment to have aged a decade. "You cannot prove it, Mr. Holmes," said he, though without conviction, as a man might repeat a form of words from which all meaning had long since drained away. A forged entry, fragment of cigar ash, a missing box. These are nothing. A clever lawyer would tear such evidence to pieces. "You are quite right, Mr. Reeves," said Holmes quietly. "Taken singly, each of these things is nothing. A coincidence, an oversight, a trifle scarcely worth remarking. It is only when they are taken together. The forged entry that points so conveniently toward Crowley, the cigar ash from a brand its owner never smoked. The document box removed from a shelf where it had stood for years. The resealed letter that was never burned at all, though you told us it was. The witness at Charing Cross, bribed, I think, to swear to a sighting that never occurred. It is only when these things are set side by side, Mr. Reeves, that they cease to be trifles, become instead the unmistakable outline of a single continuous deception, woven by a single hand, in the space of little more than a day, by a man whose ordinary work for 15 years had been the careful and convincing arrangement of figures upon a page. "You forget, Mr. Holmes." "Faust," said Reeves, and there was, for the first time, something like bitterness in his voice, "that I have spent 15 years in the service of a man who trusted me absolutely, who gave me his confidence, his authority, very nearly his friendship. Do you imagine that what happened in that study was easy? I imagine, Mr. Reeves, that it was the hardest thing you have ever done," said Holmes, and I confess I was struck, even then, by the absence of triumph in his voice. There was only a kind of grave sorrow. The sorrow of a man who has solved a puzzle only to find, at its centre, not a monster, but a human being undone, by 15 years of small dishonesties grown, at last beyond his power to contain. But I think also, Mr. Reeves, that having done it once, you found a kind of dreadful clarity in what followed. The forging of the entry, the disposal of the box, the careful construction of a story that pointed toward Crowley. For these were tasks of the kind you had performed, in a smaller way, for years. And you performed them, I think, almost without allowing yourself to consider what they meant. Reeves said nothing for a long moment, and when at last he spoke, it was in a voice scarcely audible. He kept the box at his bank, in the end, not here. He told me he had moved it the very evening before, though he would not say where. I searched this room for an hour after it was done, and could not find it. I did not know, until you spoke just now, that it had ever stood upon that shelf at all. I removed it from the shelf myself, Mr. Holmes, the night it happened, believing it still contained the evidence. I burned what was inside it, in the grate of my own lodgings. It was only old correspondence. The real proof, it seems, he had already placed beyond my reach. Then Mr. Fenwick's body, Lestrade began, is to be found, I believe, said Holmes, in a warehouse near the river, in Wapping, registered some years ago under the name of a small trading concern, which exists, so far as I have been able to discover, upon paper alone, which I have traced, through a chain of leases and subleases, to Mr. Reeves himself. Acquired, I imagine, place of safe keeping for funds and papers, whose origin would not bear examination, and pressed, on this one occasion, into a very different service. Reeves did not deny it. He sat with his head bowed, tossed, and when Lestrade at last stepped forward and spoke the words of arrest, he rose without resistance, and went from the room between two constables, with the quiet, almost relieved air of a man laying down a burden he had carried for far too long. It remains only to record the aftermath, which followed in the days that succeeded that strange evening, a swiftness that contrasted oddly with the weeks of fog and uncertainty that had preceded it. Mr. Fenwick's body was indeed recovered from the warehouse at Wapping, together with papers sufficient to establish beyond any reasonable doubt the truth of his earlier history and the full extent of Reeves's long deception. Sir Julian Markham, upon the production of these papers, cleared of the gravest charges against him, though the revelation that the irregularities in his accounts had originated with a man so close to his own affairs did his reputation no great service, and I believe he withdrew not long afterward from the more public aspects of his business, sadder, if not a poorer man. Crowley, whose disappearance had so excited Lestrade's suspicions, returned of his own accord within the week, having gone, it transpired, to visit a sick relation in Yorkshire, and was mortified beyond measure to learn the construction that had been placed upon his absences. As for Reeves, he was tried in the spring, and though the jury's verdict was never seriously in doubt, I recall that even Lestrade, hardened as he was by long acquaintance with crime in all its forms, remarked to me afterward that he had rarely encountered a case in which the guilty man seemed so little a villain, and so much a man overtaken, almost against his will, by the consequences of choices made many years before, and circumstances that none of us perhaps could say with confidence we should have resisted ourselves. It was some weeks later, on an evening when the fog had at last lifted, and a clear, cold moon hung over the rooftops of Baker Street, that I sat down to set this account in order, and found myself reflecting upon the singular course the investigation had taken. We had begun, all of us, Lestrade, Trent, even I myself, by searching for drama, for kidnappers, for blackmailers, for enemies lurking in the fog with violence in their hearts. And at every turn the facts seemed to oblige us, ranging themselves into theories so complete, so satisfying, that to doubt them seemed almost perverse. Holmes alone had refused this satisfaction. He had set aside the dramatic, not because he doubted its possibility, but because he distrusted its convenience and had turned instead to the smallest and least promising of details. A difference of ink scarcely visible to the eye. A trace of ash that did not belong, clean rectangle of dust, where something familiar had stood for years, and then, quite suddenly, had not. "You see, Watson," he said to me, when I remarked upon this, "the world is full of people eager to provide an explanation, and the more dramatic the explanation, the more eagerly it is provided, and the more eagerly believed. My own task is a humbler one. I do not ask what story best accounts for the facts as they have been presented to me. I ask, instead, what small thing has been altered or omitted, placed where it does not belong. For it is there, Watson, in the smallest of discrepancies, that the truth generally takes refuge, confident that no one will trouble to look for it. I have thought of those words often since, and I believe them to contain, much as anything Holmes ever said to me, the very essence of his method, before that reason does not triumph because it sees more than other men, but because it sees, with perfect accuracy, the one small thing that everyone else has overlooked, the end